Thank you all for having us tonight. This is really an incredible group, and we are so excited for this really amazing panel that has been put together for us. So
we're hoping that conversation and the many that have been having around the community will get us beyond hopes and prayers, right? I mean, I'm pretty tired of thoughts and prayers and hopes and prayers. But that's what we're here. We're here to have a dialogue, not a debate. We're here to seek answers, gain understanding, and encourage action around the issue of gun violence. Now, doing nothing is not an option. And I want to kind of start by just kind of laying a couple of things that I just had read as I prepared for this. 84% of U.S. adults say they have taken at least one precaution to protect themselves or their families from the possibility of gun violence. Show of hands, who here has done something to try to protect themselves? Maybe it's not go to that Super Bowl party, or maybe it's, right? I mean, it's sad, right? A Vanderbilt University poll that just came out for children showed that 2 out of 3 parents have spoken to their kids about gun violence at school. Show of hands, who here has done that? Yeah, again, things that we might have not thought about 20 years ago. 1 out of 5 parents have considered homeschooling their children because of this. Like, that saddens me as a parent of 3 kids, and it really saddens me to consider homeschool for that reason alone. And the other final quote I'm going to throw out there, and it may come up later, is gun violence is now the leading cause of death in the United States for children from 1 to 19. When I was going through med school and early in my career, and probably you as well, Jay, it was car wrecks, right? It was accidents. It wasn't gun violence. It's crazy. So with all that, that is why we're here. That's what has me engaged, and that's what has my great panelists here engaged.
I have been in the criminal system for many, many years after graduating Vanderbilt in 1994. I was only 12 when I graduated. Jay, you laugh too much. I started as a public defender in the adult division and then switched to the juvenile division in 1998 and fell in love with what juvenile court does, with the philosophy on how we can really help people change and be on the right track and make a difference in people's lives, so much more than what the adult system does. And so I fell in love, was a public defender there until 2004 when I was appointed to be one of the juvenile court magistrates, and then in 2014 when I was successfully elected as the juvenile court judge. And so I have for many, 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 many years have devoted my life to making a difference for the children and the youth that we serve and the families that we serve. And so when Alex asked me to do this, I couldn't say no, because if you know anything about Alex, if he tells you to do something, you have to do it. And so I did it, but I'm here because I absolutely know that if we work together, if we become more responsible adults, more adults that really love and care for our youth and our neighbors, that we can truly make a difference. I never lose hope in that. I always have hope, no matter what numbers come to us, no matter what stats, no matter what happens from Kansas City down to Nashville, Lewis Street, whatever it is. I continuously have hope that if we just try to do better, that we can make a difference. And that's why I'm here today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Erin Rogas. I'm the Policy Director for Voices for a Safer Tennessee. And I also wear 2 hats. I'm also former Senator Bill Frist, Policy Advisor. He serves on our advisory board for Safer Tennessee. And I'm really here because this is an issue I've been working on actually going back to 2010. I previously worked for a Republican member of Congress who was passionate about this issue, and we got to introduce some legislation, universal background checks, some other issues then that we were trying to address. And he was really coming from it from the law enforcement perspective. His father was a police officer. He saw how they were getting outgunned, how firearms were being trafficked into his state. And so, we were trying to get something done then. Sandy Hook happened in 2012. It was a real shock. I think for all of us, I'm sure many of you all kind of almost remember where you were when you heard about that horrible mass shooting. And we thought we will finally get something done here in Congress. We'll finally be able to get our Republican colleagues to co-sign our legislation. We'll get this through. And we were sort of shocked when nothing happened. And then 6 months later, I think another sort of mass shooting occurred. And as you've seen, that cadence has continued without any kind of real abatement. It's only increased. So we didn't see progress then, but I am confident that we actually are starting to see a change now. I've kind of been heartened to be able to work on this issue again here in Tennessee with Voices for a Safer Tennessee. And I think later on we'll be talking a little about kind of where we're starting to see some cracks, where there is some hope on this issue, because we do get that question, why does nothing change? Why does it seem like we keep hearing these stories and there is, nothing passed? But I do actually think, thanks to your voices, other voices, folks lending, lending their concern here, we are making progress. So thank you all for being here today, and look forward to this conversation.
Okay, well, I was born in Mississippi, which means it takes me about 5 minutes to say hello. But I was born in a small town in Mississippi, about 7,000 in the county. And from there, made my way to Duke to do my residency in neurosurgery, and then went to UAB, where I was on faculty for 10 years. Around the end of that time, I got a master's of epidemiology, a master's of public health, because I watched my epidemiology colleagues take on larger public health issues. As a surgeon, you tend to take on one patient at a time, which is admirable and good, but if you can impact things on a larger scale, like epidemiology does, like our public health colleagues do, then that made sense to me. Of course, then I promptly moved to Vanderbilt in 2012, where I was asked to grow the division of pediatric neurosurgery. In the 10 years that I've been here, I've had the opportunity to be a program director for the residency program at the Department of Neurosurgery, vice chair of the Department of Neurosurgery, and also I've run several research efforts for the surgeons at Vanderbilt. And then a few years ago, I wrote a book. And because it goes back to the Mississippi part about being a storyteller. And you can't be a neurosurgeon and write a book and not talk a little bit about the impact of gunshot wounds on people. And then I found myself writing some editorials. And then I watched, in all honesty, Alex be an orthopedic surgeon and become very involved with the vaccination and the public health effort during the pandemic. And I thought to myself, if I've got training in epidemiology and I'm on the front lines in the ERs and the ORs taking care of these children, and I can write about it, then why not begin to advocate for safety and for gun safety and for our children? I also was just elected the president of the American Society of Pediatric Neurosurgeons, and the first thing that we did was start a task force for gun safety. We signed on with the American College of Surgeons and several other groups so that we can really begin to make an impact on this. So I feel very passionate about this, and I'm very honored to be here. And Alex, thank you for asking me to do it.
Thank you. Judge Calloway, since 2014, you've been, you probably noticed the state laws have changed a lot regarding gun violence, or gun access, right? First, concealed carry, being able to put guns in cars, and so forth. Can you speak to what you've witnessed over your time on the bench and even before, and how these legislative changes that you've noted have or have not impacted what you're experiencing in your day-to-day?
I'm going to be a little transparent. When I was young, I didn't think it was cool to ride the school bus. And so I tried to get rides with different people, and so I didn't have to get on the school bus because it just wasn't cool when you was high school to have to ride on the school bus. And for whatever reason, there's this obsession with cars and kids. That hasn't really changed. And so when I was a public defender, I would go to different schools and talk to people about, if your friend says, let's go for a ride, and y'all both freshmen and y'all 14, I bet he don't have a license, and I bet he don't have permission to drive that car. So don't get in it. So for years, the biggest crime that we see with children are stealing cars. And the more we get sophisticated in our cars, the easier it becomes for them to steal, because they can just take a fob and hit buttons and open anything. And that just has been a steady for us. The one thing that we haven't been able to really change is how many cars kids steal. The difference is, since there have been more and more relaxed laws on what adults can carry and where they can carry, now they steal cars, and there always are guns in those cars. And a lot of times, which drives me absolutely crazy, is that people leave their cars unlocked, have easy access, and the gun is easy to find in the car. And so what we see on a regular basis now, we don't see the number of cars being stolen necessarily change, but what we're seeing is the number of guns that are being stolen from the cars each year has increased more and more. And so when you have youth who don't have fully developed brains, and the part of the brain... I can vouch for that. You wrote that. The part of the brain that is the last to develop is the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that makes decisions. And so, on average, we fully develop our brains when we're around 25. For men, it's about 40. And so, did you write that too?
No, but I'm going to start quoting laws and codes up here in just a minute. That's really impressive.
So when you have a 16-year-old whose prefrontal cortex has not quite developed, and they see a gun, and they see a car, and it's open, they're going to grab it, and they're going to play with it. In their mind, play with it. And that's where the problem comes in.
The most recent statewide survey shows that 75% of voters support temporary transfer laws that temporarily restrict access to guns for individuals who are at the highest risk of harming themselves and others. Okay, 75%. I thought politics is all about polls and going the right way and stuff like that. Even in politics most of your career, why has the state legislature not even moved a little bit, even though 75% of this state wants something done?
Sure. Happy to answer that. And yes, I've worked in Republican politics for most of my career, and so there is some frustration. Why are we seeing these events happening and no movement? And so I'm actually going to disagree with that statement. I do think something is happening. I mentioned I previously worked on firearm safety issues in Congress, and in 2012 when Sandy Hook happened, and nothing was passed, and that was so shocking. But then in 2022, the Uvalde school shooting happened. Again, horrific. But we actually saw a change then. Voters had had enough. And we actually had Republican and Democratic lawmakers at the federal level come together, led by a Republican senator from Texas, John Cornyn, and they passed the 2022 Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which is the most significant piece of federal firearms legislation we've seen in nearly 30 years. Now, did it solve all our problems? Certainly not. We're still having this conversation today, right? But it is a step forward. It did make some changes that were needed. And so that, to me, is a change, is some progress. Last year, after the tragedy at the Covenant School, we had Governor Lee, who arguably is probably our strongest Second Amendment governor that we've ever had in Tennessee. He paused and said, okay, we need to do something different. He proposed an order of protection law. When the legislature didn't take that up, he said, all right, let's come back again for a special session on public safety and see what we can get done. And the legislature, they passed some small building block laws there. Again, did it solve all our problems? No, but they are still having these conversations now, even just this week and last week. The House Republican leader, Leader Lamberth, has a bill that's in response to the Belmont student who was shot this past November, by an individual who deemed incompetent to stand trial and was released. And so he had that family there testifying about their daughter and about what they're now calling Jillian's Law to kind of address some of the problems there. So, and that's one of his top priorities, is to address this issue we have now with those deemed incompetent to stand trial being able to purchase, still being able to legally purchase firearms and not having really a system to get them the treatment and help they need. So I think those are steps forward. we have to keep beating the drum so that they know we need more than what they've done so far. But I think we've got some momentum in Safer Tennessee, and you all are here to build on that. Wine in grocery stores, that took 7 years to pass. Like, who is upset or opposed to wine in grocery stores? But that was a multi-year lobbying campaign to get something done. And so, again, this is a little tougher issue than grocery store wine, but I do think that if we keep coming back to it and they keep hearing voters, and again, we've done some polling on our own at Safer Tennessee, specifically looking at Republican primary voters, because we want to, part of it's education, of letting lawmakers know, hey, we've actually looked at your constituents, talked to them, engaged them on these issues, and the Republican primary voters are supportive of the core issues that we're trying to advance. So, yeah, I think there's hope.
No, thank you. Now, Jay, I think one thing you and I share is we're both deal with a lot of trauma from gun violence, and whether you're going to bring it up or not, Jay was the neurosurgeon on call about a year ago when Covenant happened, and you see this all the time, and a lot of times we don't talk about it, right? We don't hear about it in the news. You don't hear about the aftermath. You don't hear the pain that the families have. You being the rest of you, I know you do. Can you get a little personal here? Like, can you share with us kind of the impact that has both on you as a surgeon, as an individual, and what do you hope? Like, what do you see we can do to impact things?
Or when you guys talked about right after Uvalde, at the time I was on the executive committee of the American Society of Pediatric Neurosurgeons. It's a long thing to say, but there was this unbelievable sense of helplessness from pediatric neurosurgeons across North America. So this will take about 4 minutes to read, and then I'll talk for a little bit. My friend Ann Patchett, the writer, always tells me to make sure I tell people how long I'm going to read, so they don't think I'm going to read for 25 minutes, so it's going to take very long. So warning, so this is a piece that was in Time magazine right after Uvalde. Warning, this is graphic. I still remember those 2 blood vessels deep in that boy's brain, shredded by a bullet fired into a crowded playground. The same bullet that blew fragments of one side of the teenager's skull into his brain on its way in, and a larger chunk of skull on the opposite side of his head off. There was so much damage that it didn't even look like a human brain. When he came in, blood was spurting out of both the entrance and the exit wound, up and out from these 2 injured deep vessels, as we would come to find out directly. How did he even make it into the hospital with this much damage? I remember thinking as we moved him in unison from the stretcher to the OR bed. Most of the kids that are shot in the head like this die at the scene. That's been the case for as long as I've done this work. Once we're able to get a larger part of his skull off in order to try to get better access, bright red arterial blood shot up from the depths of his frontal lobe, past my own head and the head of my assistant, a senior neurosurgery resident who calmly and efficiently worked at my side. Our surgical loops were both covered in a fine red spray and smudged on the side where the circulating nurse had tried to help by wiping them while we frantically worked. No matter what we did, the blood kept coming from deep inside the boy's head. Clip, I called out to the scrub nurse, louder than intended, but above the chaos of the operating room, as everyone struggled with trying to save his life. Which one, she asked. I don't care, damn it, I said, any of them. She carefully handed me a spring-loaded straight aneurysm clip on the end of an instrument designed to allow me to release the clip off the end and occlude the offending vessel to stop the bleeding. I blindly put the clip applier down between the frontal lobes of the brain where the blood was coming from in rapid pulsating geysers. I released it, hoping that at least some of the bleeding would stop. No change. We're losing the blood pressure came from the anesthesiologist on the other side of the surgical drapes. The brain was swelling up and out of the remaining skull. After a few more seconds, I could no longer see the actual 2 blood vessels. I think it was 2 blood vessels that were pumping this boy's life away and onto the floor. By the end, the resident and I had applied 4 clips down into the gap, and the rapid blood loss had stopped. We got the boy off the table and to the pediatric ICU. He lived just long enough for his parents to say goodbye. Then his brain swelled one last time, and he was gone. I remember the wails of his parents as I walked back down the hall of the ICU after a conversation that no parent should ever have to have as they realized their teenage son would never come home. Over the few weeks after Uvalde, I received waves of emails from the leadership of organized pediatric neurosurgery, surgeons I've known for decades from every part of the U.S. The sense of frustration clear. We have to do something. Somebody has to do something. Why does this keep happening? As surgeons, we find ourselves left trying to fix the ghastly results of so much of this gun violence that seems endemic in our country. There's an idea among my colleagues that we should write something up and send it somewhere where a lot of people will read it. A colleague from St. Louis mentions me, and it takes off from there. When you write it, Jay, you tell them about the kids we see who come in after a gunshot to the head, where it looks like a bomb went off on their CT scan, one said. How the parents cry and cry and cry when we tell them that their child is brain dead. Tell them how awful it is when there is nothing you can do. All of us in our field understand that. Or tell them about my patient, said Tina, an experienced neurosurgeon at Mass General, who spurned the advances of her brother's friend enough times that he finally took out a handgun and shot her in the neck, immediately paralyzing her and committing her to a ventilator for the rest of her life. She continued, I still remember her mouthing several days later, I thought I was doing all the right things. Yes, said Sam, a pediatric neurosurgeon from Seattle who co-founded a startup. You tell them the stories and then tell them that we implore, no, demand actions on the part of our leaders. Then from a colleague in Connecticut, John, a military veteran and leader of our field in advocacy for common sense gun laws, understand that the events in Texas this week are the result of deliberate choices, actions, and policies that have been pursued over the last half-century by citizens, industry, and politicians. Unlike other issues that have been pursued by public health advocates, firearms have constitutional and legislative protections that confound approaches that have been utilized for motor vehicle safety and tobacco. Any solutions will require a well-considered strategy and long-term commitment. John and I talk offline. He's a close friend of many years. His life was forever affected by his time serving our country in the U.S. Army. It was also forever affected by the time that he stood in the emergency department close to Sandy Hook Elementary years ago as the calls began to come in. He and his surgical team in medical gowns ready for the waves of injured children, waiting and waiting and waiting until they realized no one is coming. No one survived to make it here. The emails from pediatric neurosurgeons all across our field continue to come in. Ideas, stances, arguments, how to strong come out with position, how political to be, who to team up with. Should we act now? Is it too late? Who do we call? Does anybody know a senator? All of it. The back and forth, the frustration, the anger, welling up in a place of complete helplessness. Helplessness from pediatric neurosurgeons who, like many in healthcare, are used to leaning in, used to running towards the inferno, to saving lives, to seeing problems and doing something about them. Let me be clear, the death of children from any injury or any reason is heartbreaking. And the fact that gun-related death is the #1 killer of our children, more than motor vehicle collisions and childhood cancer, what our medical journals have been telling us over the past few months, is a failure of our society and needs to be changed. Drills will not stop the first classroom a shooter enters from becoming a slaughterhouse. The reliable effectiveness of guards with guns is now an unclear and perhaps proven fallacy. Finding a common ground between those on both sides should not be so hard if we start with no child should be shot at school. Now, I'm not a political person. In fact, as a son of the South, I've lived in Mississippi, North Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, and now back in Tennessee. Guns and guns culture are second nature to me. My friends and I were brought up to understand the importance of their responsible use. Just a few years ago, I found my old .22 rifle as we cleaned out my family's Mississippi home of 50 years. I brought it home, cleaned it, and taught both my teenage son and daughter how to target shoot and how to be safe around it. The same day I found that gun in my father's old gun cabinet, however, I found a baseball nestled in a little golden baseball glove in a trophy that was sitting on the top of that same cabinet. It was signed by my entire Little League team that I played with as a 10-year-old. The fact that nearly 40 years ago, 2 of those 14 little boys lost their life to gun violence before reaching adulthood tells me that the effect of gun misuse on children has been around for a long time. What has not been around for a long time, however, are these modern, readily available weapons that combine large capacity, low recoil, and high velocity rounds designed to inflict maximum destruction to human tissue. To be clear, surgical knowledge and weapons of war have always been partners. Advances of one have often led to the advances of the other. With war and the business of maiming comes the ability to learn medical reasons that are then taken back to the civilian world. With the Civil War, it was finally understanding aspects of post-op wound care. From the Great War came knowledge of the function of the peripheral nerves. From World War II, the Korean War, and Vietnam, advances in modern resuscitation and antibiotic use. But in modern war, the destructive power of armaments has increased exponentially and would have been unimaginable just a generation ago, much less to those regarded the use of arms during the musket era. Body armor is now standard issue. If you were so unlucky to be hit by a musket ball, your likely cause of death would have been infection. A round from an AR-15 explodes flesh, shatters bone, and causes a cavity of destruction significantly larger than the bullet itself, destroying everything in its path. When I was a junior faculty member several years ago, I remember a visiting Army surgeon talking about how helmets that didn't cover enough of the back of the head were immediate targets for snipers in Afghanistan. But what we're talking about here is not war. Civilians have no Kevlar helmets or body armor. The damage caused by modern weaponry far outpaces our ability to educate or resuscitate. Civilians in a place of worship or a school or a bus stop are not thinking about how to best attack and defend their position or how to best escape a room while taking live fire. And they shouldn't have to. The very idea that one of the Uvalde victims covered herself with her dead friend's blood in order to trick the killer into thinking that she was also dead should stop every citizen of this country cold. Now, I'm just a brain surgeon, and I will leave the politics to the politicians. We will keep trying in the ERs and operating rooms of this country, but there is nothing that trauma surgeons, neurosurgeons, and orthopedic surgeons, emergency department personnel can do if these children are injured so grievously that they die at the scene. We can teach our children to run, we can teach them to hide, to hold pressure, to wait for the police, and even to fight back. But until we acknowledge the role that assault weapons have on these horrific events, the same cycle will continue to repeat over and over and over again. The unimaginable has become the routine. If people could only see what my colleagues and I see in these trauma bays across the country, I believe their politics of extremism would give way to their humanity, and common sense legislation would be within our grasp. On the morning of the Covenant school shooting, I got a page to come to the ER that there was a gunshot wound, and my resident and nurse practitioner, who's amazing, were headed down. And then I got a page or a call from the chief medical officer, John Thomas, at Children's Hospital. And John Thomas said, "Jay, this isn't a drill. This is a real deal. This is a mass casualty event, and we need you downstairs." And I went downstairs, and I was part of a team of 40 people who waited and waited and waited, just like my colleagues did at Uvalde, just like John Martin did at Newtown in Sandy Hook. You wait and you wait and you wait. And when something pulls up, an ambulance pulls up, the whole crowd pushes forward thinking that you're about to be able to help. And then they realize, oh, it's not a patient. It's not from Covenant. And finally, after 45 minutes, they called us all into the same center place, and somebody stood up on a chair and said, "Nobody's coming. Nobody survived. Nobody survived." So this is an issue that is recurrent. It keeps happening. We take care of it in the OR. Back in the back of the room is Sri Reddy. She's the head of pediatric neuroanesthesia. She's done her work in saving a lot of these kids' lives, or doing the best that we can when we're faced with this unmitigating bleeding that we can't stop. And it's just it's a very passionate place that we come to when at the age of 54, after doing tons of operations on these kids, it's only increasing. And can we put that first slide up? And then Alex, I'll shut up because I know I've been going for a while. But this one right here is super important to me because this is the one that came out in the New England Journal of Medicine, and that's the big one for us. And I imagine that many of you have probably seen this. But if you look at the top line coming down is motor vehicle crashes. Yes, there's a little hook at the end, but that's substantial, and that fits with what Alex said, which is the first thing that we saw. You know, when we were in residency back in the 1600s, it was motor vehicle crash. But now you can see that firearm-related injury has acutely gone up. And everything else has gone down, including malignant neoplasm. Now, drugs overdose and poisoning is not, and that's another topic for another day. But All the rest of the trends are down, except for firearm-related injury. So clearly we have an issue, and clearly it's going to take people on the ground and people at higher levels to fix this problem. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you. So Voices for a Safer Tennessee outlines 3 gun safety policy reforms to the Tennessee legislature. 1, enact temporary transfer laws for persons showing elevated risk of harming themselves or others. Number 2, implement stronger firearm storage laws that require firearm owners to provide secure storage and report lost weapons. And 3, a consistent background check requirement across all firearm transactions. Now, Judge Calloway, obviously, you've thought about law for a long time. What's your take? Here's just a frank question. Will these simple reforms make a difference? And more so, I would love to hear a couple of suggestions from you about, if not these, then what? Like, what do we need to think about? And be specific, if you would. And everyone's going to get a chance to answer that, please.
So I'll just start and say, I enjoyed hearing what Erin said, and I hope that her hopefulness that the change will come if we keep pushing is a reality. I don't know if I'm as hopeful right now. To be quite honest, I don't know if I see things changing much at all. But that doesn't mean I quit working and I quit talking and quit trying. I do think the things that have been outlined by Safer Tennessee policies are definitely things that will make a difference. I know directly if a child steals a car that has a gun in it, if the gun is in a container, a lock, or something where they are unable to access that, that's going to mean one less gun in a hands of someone who does not understand how to operate it and who doesn't know how to use it. That can be helpful. If there's definitely a list of folks that we can look at based on whether it's a court filing or a doctor filing or whatever, and says that this person would not be safe having a gun, that would be helpful. That would make a difference. I'm with Dr. J. If we outlaw certain types of guns that are not meant to use on a everyday basis to carry around, that would be helpful. That would make a difference. I get frustrated a lot when I hear, instead of passing these common sense type laws, that our legislature picks other things to say, well, let's focus on this instead. For instance, over the last 10 years, believe it or not, and you probably don't believe it unless you're in the system, but statewide juvenile crime is down over the last 10 years about 60 to 70%. And that's the numbers reported from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. Those are accurate, true numbers that show that we really are making a difference on youth crime in our communities across the state. But what I'm understanding is what the legislature are trying to do now is to say, well, it's these young kids that are getting guns that are causing all these problems, so let's be more punitive and let's lock up more kids so that we won't have that gun violence. When you look at the number of youth in gun violence compared to adults in gun violence, yes, more kids are getting killed. More kids are getting killed, but the number of youth that are causing the crime is not higher than the number of adults. So what we're saying is let's blame the youth for what's happening instead of fixing the true problems of what could make a difference. So I say all that to say, I hope that the legislature will eventually pass common sense legislature, not pass laws that penalize the wrong category of people, particularly our most vulnerable people, our children in our community, can really work to make us be more responsible adults and responsible gun holders.
One of the things that's interesting about firearm violence and the sort of policies to address it, we are just now starting to get good data on how to do that, because there was actually a federal amendment, the Dickey Amendment, which passed in 1996, that prevented federal funding to advocate or promote gun control. And this essentially put a freeze on CDC funding, NIH funding, all that funding that would normally go to research the things that are causing disease and death in our country. That was all frozen. And so it only really got essentially overturned in 2018. So we are just now starting to see federal funding flowing to research these important issues of, what is now the number one killer of our children. How do we, what are studies saying will actually turn the tide on that? And so as we're seeing this data come out, this is what's informing Voices for a Safer Tennessee's policy positions. And we're also looking at not only what is evidence-based, but also what has bipartisan support, recognizing that we are a Republican supermajority state. What can we get across the finish line here? And so again, the expanded background checks, we want a background check on every single firearm transaction. States that have that in place, studies have shown they've seen a 13 to 15% reduction in firearm homicides. With temporary transfer laws, where it would allow law enforcement to petition the court to temporarily restrict firearm access to those who are posing a threat to themselves or others in a period of crisis. That's been shown to reduce suicides in the states that have it on the books the longest, Connecticut and Indiana. They've seen a 14% reduction and an 8% reduction there. And what most people realize is that actually the majority of our firearm deaths, 54%, are suicides, both in Tennessee and nationwide. So this is a good tool for that as well. Requiring secure storage of firearms, when you pair that with child access prevention laws, it's been shown to reduce accidental shootings conducted by children and also youth suicide, with a reduction in firearm death around 6%. And we are, unfortunately, in Tennessee, we are third in the nation for unintentional shootings by children and in the top 10 states in the nation for youth suicide by firearm. Those are not areas we want to be leading on, and so we need to be passing policies that will proactively address that.
What we see in the emergency rooms are the young child that's grabbed a gun off a table or out at their parents' bedside table and pointed it at their brother or sibling or sister or sibling and pulled the trigger. And that's one thing we see. We see drive-by shootings. That's another thing we see. We see suicide by guns that are accessible. And then unfortunately, recently, we've seen these mass shootings. Judge, if I say anything inappropriate here from a race standpoint, I want you to correct me. But I will tell you that my experience over 20 years of doing this work is that this has been an epidemic in young black children for a long time. And it's only been because of the school shootings now that it's coming to the forefront. And so it's been a long time coming that we're taking this issue on, and I'm very glad that we're doing it because it's disproportionately affected the youth of those communities, and it's not fair. So on that same continuum, you think about the way to limit the age of people who can buy guns and their mental capacity. Can you limit that ability to buy guns? And then you move to a place like, what about safe storage? And then you move to a place like, what about gun locks? And then you move to a place like limiting things like bump stocks or those triggers that allow you to go from a semi-automatic weapon to an automatic weapon. And let me be clear about AR-15s. They're designed to kill people. They are low recoil. So a high velocity bullet means it's going to do a lot of damage. And it's going to hit a bone and it's going to fragment, and those fragments then cavitate. And the hole in the front is a lot different than the hole in the back. So they're high velocity. You can put a lot of bullets. There's a high magazine, large magazines. You can hold a lot of bullets. And then this is the key, is that they're low recoil. So what that means is that you can aim on a target and you're not getting a bunch of, as we called it in Mississippi, a lot of kick. You're not getting a kick. You're just, boop, boop, boop. You can pump a lot of bullets into the same target. And that's why you see so much damage. So all the way on the other end of that spectrum is limitation of assault weapons. Now, what we've learned is that the moment that you begin to talk about limiting having an assault weapon ban, the actual number of assault weapon sales goes up, it spikes. So we have to say, all right, is that something that we can do or not do? If you start talking about limiting bump stocks and limiting those triggers, those quick triggers, those things start go up in sales. So to me, the things that are the lowest hanging fruit are the things in the middle that we've already talked about, are the things like saying that somebody under a certain age or saying that somebody who has mental capacity issues needs to not be able to purchase a gun, having the ability to take away a gun from somebody who's suicidal or homicidal, having people mandate that we have guns in safes at homes or gun locks, something to keep those guns out of the hands of little children who shoot themselves or shoot their siblings. And also to keep it out of the hands of teenagers who are being socially bullied on social media, who are going through all the challenges that all of us had when we were teenagers, now ad infinitum because of all the pressures that we have. So we have to have a way to secure the weapons in the household. So those are the things that I believe are where we should focus our policy on.
Thanks. For the panel, what recommendations do you have for schools to support students, K through 12, with building decision-making skills, especially in the face of challenges, trauma, or when facing a disadvantage? I open that for anyone that may want to respond to that. I think it's such an important question.
Okay, can I just say real quick that the NRA has cut funding to education of gun safety, and so that means that gun safety has to come from somewhere. Does it come from Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts? Does it come from Ducks Unlimited? Maybe it should be part of a school curriculum, just like there's sex education, just like there's other public health topics that are talked about. Maybe there's a discussion about how, from the very beginning, that guns are not to be picked up at home, guns are not to be turned to when you feel suicidal. Here are other options. That's an idea, I'm just putting it out there. Because right now there's not, the gun education, the gun safety education world has substantially declined.
I was in elementary school about 10 years ago, and when I was growing up in elementary school, y'all didn't get that one. All right, 20 years ago when I was in elementary school, it was a different atmosphere. We would have like fights, but there was absolutely never, ever, ever any weapons. And we grew up in a different world. When you turn on your TV right now, all you see are, unless you watch reality shows or game shows like I do, all you're really going to see are shows that glorify guns and glorify violence and glorify fighting and even on, a lot of the reality shows glorify fighting and violence with each other. We're not teaching our children how to deal with conflict in a appropriate way. We're not teaching them how to overcome traumas. And so I am happy to be a part of the two administrations of our school system that are insisting that part of the money that they get from the budget from our community is going to be placed with social and emotional learning, that we put programs in all of the schools, that we have things that teach us about restorative justice and how you build each other up through conflict. Those things are happening. They could be happening more if we had more funding and we had better programs to do, but it is teaching a handful of or a large number of our youth how to deal with conflicts and how to survive through the traumas that they live through.
I wish we could include in this conversation that these are predominantly gang-related, juvenile on juvenile, in an era where assault laws are seen as a tool of an oppressive government. In your experience as somebody who sits on a bench on juvenile crimes, any comments to that?
So I'm not really sure if that is true, at least not in Nashville. I don't think that the youth who are dying from gun violence is necessarily gang or necessarily juvenile on juvenile. There are a lot of suicides that are happening with our youth in our community. There are a lot of accidental shootings where a child finds a gun and plays with the gun and shoots someone on accident. I see those kind of incidents more. When I look at the numbers of our juvenile crime, again, over the years, particularly in Davidson County, juvenile crime has decreased over about 60% over the past years. Since 2000 and, I'm going to say, my chart says from 2011 to 2013 down to 2022, juvenile crime has actually decreased 67%. And that's the number of youth that are being arrested. The assault charges and the aggravated assault charges have also decreased. The two charges that have not decreased are what I said in the beginning were the car thefts and the possession of handguns. And it goes one and one. They're stealing cars that have guns in them. And then they're taking those guns and they're not using them responsibly. So I'm not sure if it's true that we do have some gangs, we do have some youth that are in gangs, but that is not the source of what the youth problem that we see in juvenile court is. That's probably a handful of the youth that we have. We do have a program in juvenile court called Gang Resistance Intervention Program, where we work with those youth who have been identified by the Metro Police as part of a gang, and that we probably have at most 20 to 40 of those kids. The rest of them are not. And so that is probably a mistaken belief, and I have not seen any facts that support that. But what we absolutely have to do is to figure out how to get kids not to steal cars and get adults to carry weapons in their car to carry them in a responsible manner.
Thank you.
And actually, can I just build a little bit on what Judge Calloway is saying? And actually, Kitty, if you could advance the slides, just 2 slides. I think we've got, one more. There we go. So I think this is actually a good indication of what Judge Calloway was just saying. And this is a recent slide showing the change in the number of guns stolen from cars over time here in Tennessee. So we are now #1 in the nation for firearms stolen from cars. And in 2013, we had 46 guns stolen from cars statewide. In 2022, we had about 5,400 guns. So what changed in that time? It wasn't that we had a bunch more juveniles who were suddenly decided to be delinquent. What changed is some laws that had, they had good intentions, but have had some unintended consequences now of a lot more firearms being in vehicles. So 2013 was guns in trunks, where now individuals can bring their firearm, leave it stored in their unoccupied vehicle locked. But as Judge Calloway mentioned, a lot of people don't always lock it, don't always securely store it in their vehicle. So now you have a lot of folks just checking handles, seeing which cars are open. And then, with permitless carry passing in 2021, a larger number of folks then also carrying as well. So we just have an increased access issue, which is one of the things we're working on at Safer Tennessee.
Thank you. I'm going to 2 more questions, one for you and one for you. So Erin, this one's for you. It seems that all of this boils down to the politicians. In the face of the violence and statistics of the will of the majority of the constituents, what is causing their hesitancy? Ms. Rogan.
Sure. So the vast majority of our elected lawmakers in the legislature, they're representing rural parts of the state. And there's a perception that this is just an urban issue. It's not a rural issue. That's not true. We know, for example, that suicides by firearm disproportionately impact our rural areas. East Tennessee has a suicide rate by firearm that's double that of the Memphis region, for example. But in addition, those races are all, for the most part, decided in the primary. So they're concerned about being primaried from the right. And even though the NRA has lost a lot of its funding and ability to financially impact races, it still does have some impact of being able to come and endorse a candidate, and they can put the NRA name on their mailer, being an A rating, that type of thing. And so part of our work at Safer Tennessee is educating these lawmakers, again, that these are issues, like I said, expanded background checks, universal background checks. That has 80% plus support among Republican primary voters that we found when we've done polling. Temporary transfer laws, again, in the 60% with Republican primary voters. So we're doing some education with them, letting them know, A, this is not going to cost you your primary battle. And then second, we also, though, need folks like you to be, and you're here today, you're probably showing up to vote. But if you look at the primary election voter totals, it is shockingly low. It is stunning, the number of people that are actually determining who is going to the legislature to determine our laws. So if you are not voting in all the primary elections, you definitely need to be. Davidson County, if you're here in Davidson, the lawmakers are already with us on these issues. But if you've got family, friends in rural counties who are not activated on this yet, we really need you to reach out to them and let them know we need them to be engaging on this as well, letting their lawmaker know it's a priority, and also showing up to vote, because at the end of the day, if we're not happy with what our lawmakers are doing, we have to, we can use our voice to vote.
Thank you. Actually, I lied. I have two more questions, one for you and one for you. So, Dr. Wellons.
Yes, sir.
This question hits home. How do healthcare professionals cope with the loss of firearm-related violence, and what are ways that you and your colleagues are supported? And then just additionally, there's another question about wanting to link to that article, so if you can maybe cite where that came from too.
Yep, absolutely. I just want to come off what Erin said just a minute and just say that I have gone into Rotary clubs in rural Tennessee to have this conversation with people. And I was expecting a tremendous amount of pushback. But in reality, if you go into a situation and you emphasize, like if you think about like a normal distribution curve, okay, of a population, of whatever political issue it is, and we put it right down the middle. Here's the left and here's the right. Okay, the first standard deviation on both sides, that encompasses 67% of the population, okay? What that means is that you are actually more alike the person on the other side in the first standard deviation than you are like the person in the fifth or sixth standard deviation on the same side as you are. So if we can go into these places and emphasize the fact that we are more alike than we are different, that we think more similarly about things. If we start with the idea that no child should be shot at school, then we can come together and come up with real solutions. That's really what I believe. Now, in terms of your question, Alex, and I mean, I think to honestly, writing the book was part of just the need to be cathartic about it. I mean, the first death I had was as a resident, when somebody was at a party and got hit by a bullet that came back down through their head, and there was blood squirting out through their skull, and we took them to the OR, and my attending didn't even have time to come in, and I was the chief resident, and I was trying to get the blood stopped, and all of a sudden I was working at this vessel at the base of the brain, and all of a sudden it turned from blood to water. And what it was all the IV fluids. We'd lost all the blood. And I looked up at the screen, and there was a boop, and I couldn't figure out why nobody else was working. Why did everybody stop? And literally, like you see on the TV shows, they had to pull me away. Like literally, just like on the TV shows. And I was covered with blood. I remember going into this shower at Duke in the OR and showering, and the blood was all the way through my surgical gown, all the way through my scrubs, all the way through my underwear, plastered on the hair of my stomach. And I just watched that blood run down into the drain at the base of the shower. I mean, we are not just touching this topic. We are squarely in this topic. And, the ability that we have now to talk about it with other people, to process it, to have therapy, which I'm a proud therapy goer, is really important. Because if we don't feel like that we can make a difference about it, that we can't speak about it, when we were told that it wasn't our lane, that was not the right thing to be said because it's squarely our lane. If we feel like that we can make an impact and crawl this issue forward, I think that's the way that we make ourselves feel better about it.
Yeah. After Covenant, one of my colleagues, I oversee a part of the hospital. We we had to have this colleague let this person know it was okay to take some time off, and this person did. And this person came back and told me that they were in a much better place and that they were in a really dark space. And I think, I would say 15, 20 years ago, none of us would have paid attention to that. And it's sad because I've had colleagues, trauma surgeon colleagues, jump off buildings right around here. And it happens. And it's, so it's important. So I asked the question, like, and it's not just healthcare professionals, I think all of us in our jobs. So it's important to recognize that it's okay to ask if somebody's okay. It's okay to not be okay and to give them the freedom. I know I've done that professionally, and I know everyone here has. One last question, and because I think it's actually one that I actually have and don't know the answer to, and I'm curious, and it's a legal question. How significant is the recent verdict of the Jennifer Crumbley, I assume that's the individual whose son killed somebody in Michigan, and do you think that there could be potentially an impact on our legislature here in Tennessee? Judge Calloway and maybe Erin, if you have any insight.
So I do think there is some significance in that case. I do think that there has been more of a push in the court system to hold parents responsible for the actions of their children. I think in that case, it was I wasn't there, I didn't hear all of the evidence, but I heard the clips from the news, but it was fairly clear that these parents were not being protective of their child and were allowing their child, knowing that their child was at risk, knowing that he was suffering, knowing that he had thoughts of using a weapon and doing things. They were not actively trying to prevent him from doing so. So I think the facts in that case are clear from what we hear in the news that they held some responsibility. I don't know if you're going to get that from a whole lot of cases. A whole lot of cases, parents may not know, or may have known and don't know how to respond or don't know how to act. I think what Ms. Crumbley, the statements that they said she made or the statement that she agreed that she made were very glaringly unprotective of her child. And unprotective of the community, knowing that there was some risk. I don't think you're going to get that in a whole lot of cases. I think there's ways to do that now without any changes in the law. But if you don't have a case as clear cut like that one, I don't think that there's going to be a lot of convictions like that, like you see in that case.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with Judge Calloway on that. There's actually the New York Times has a good podcast on this. The Daily has a recent podcast on it that does a really good job of kind of explaining this case and how it is a bit of an outlier because of just how clear-cut the situation was, where the parents actually purchased the firearm for their son, even though he had expressed mental health concerns. That the day of the shooting, he had drawn, I think, graphic images of a shooting on his worksheet. The parents were called down that day, saying, we have serious concerns. He needs mental health help within the next 48 hours. Ideally now, because we think he could hurt himself or others. And they said, yeah, well, he needs to stay in school. Well, we got to go back to work. And, the shooting happened later that day. And he had the gun in his backpack, and they did not tell the, counselors or anything. We also just happened to have purchased him a firearm not that long ago. So there's an extreme level of liability there that I think that you might not find in many other cases. I do think it is good, though, that we are having more responsibility there, but we also need to just recognize that for most of these youths who are using firearms in these kind of shooting situations, they are accessing them at home because it's the parent's firearm, and they don't realize that the kid even knows how to get to it, or they just think, oh, my child would never try and take my gun for these kind of purposes. So it's really, I think, secure storage is a much more effective approach there versus potentially going through the legal system and trying to prosecute parents.
And I will add, Alex, there's been a couple of cases here in Davidson County where there was some charges for parents. It hasn't happened often. I remember a girl in the Casey Homes, I think, housing project where the gun was left and stepfather kind of ran, and that person was charged. And then also in the Waffle House shooting, the father that gave him the gun back was also charged. And so we have done that, that's like after the fact. And if we do some things like safe storage, we'll never have to get there. And so the law is the slowest thing in the world, in my opinion, and changes in the law take forever. And so if we wait for laws to really, really change, we're going to lose a whole lot of lives. And so we've got to do more proactive things on the front end.
Thank you. I want to thank all of you for taking this opportunity to speak with us. I hope the conversation has been great for you all and informative. And again, I'm very grateful. Claudia and I believe our school director, Amani Reed, is coming up. So thank you again for hosting us, Amani. Thank you.